Bonjour French students, bienvenue au vidéo 3 du chapitre 5. So remember last time you learned about le passé composé avec avoir. Remember that avoir means to have and that it's considered a helping verb or a auxiliary verb. I can never say that word. Okay, so just to review what you learned last time, you learned about the passé composé avec avoir, and I will show you the conjugation very quickly just so you kind of remember what this was all about. So if you want to say that you did something in the past, that you have done something in the past, you would use this composed verb form. So you have a form of avoir plus the past participle. And the past participle is just the form of the verb that goes with the helping verb when you put it all together to make this tense. And I told you that in English, one form of past tense that we use is the present perfect, and it looks like these verbs. So I have spoken or I have slept. And the rough equivalent to that in French would be j'ai parlé, j'ai dormi. Okay. So that's one way of forming what we call le passé composé in French. But there's another way to do this, and that's the topic of today's video. Okay, so we'll start just by getting familiar with some forms that we would see in this other way of expressing le passé composé. And you'll notice that the helping verb in all of these examples is a little bit different than what you saw in le passé composé avec avoir. Okay, so just pointing this out with a different color, kind of getting you to notice the pattern. All right, so up here it says, je suis parti en voyage. Je suis. Okay, again, I'm going to point out that helping verb. I'm also going to point out this extra E that we have on the past participle for feminine form. Usually we use the feminine form just when we're like making adjectives agree with nouns, but we're going to see with the passé composé and this new way of using passé composé that we have to think about gender agreement here too. All right. La dernière fois que vous êtes parti en voyage, où est-ce que vous êtes allé? Qu'est-ce que vous avez fait? Okay, so the last time that you went on a trip, vous êtes parti en voyage. Partir is basically to like go out or leave to go somewhere. So vous êtes parti en voyage. Again, we have another helping verb to pay attention to here. Hey, où est-ce que vous êtes allé? Hey, where did you go? Qu'est-ce que vous avez fait? Notice that we have avoir as our helping verb here. Out of all the helping verbs, avait, a form of avoir, is the only one that is different. Okay, so what's going on? All right, so it means that certain verbs, very often verbs of motion, are verbs that use être as a helping verb to form the passé composé instead of avoir. The majority of verbs use avoir as their helping verb to form passé composé, but there are maybe, a dozen or a little more than that that use the verb être. Okay, so we can answer this question in a few ways. Qu'est-ce que vous avez fait? Je suis allé à Denver, à New York. So this is saying I went to Denver, I went to New York, or I went somewhere else. So to give you a chance to practice saying this, you can fill in the blank with your own destination here. So, je suis allé à... Okay, the one underneath, je suis parti en mars le matin vers 3 heures, quelque chose d'autre. So I went in March in the morning and around 3 o'clock, vers 3 heures, or some other time or place, I guess. Okay, So in your case, let's say you said, je suis allé à Greenville, okay? Je suis parti quand? When did you go? Was it in the morning? Was it in March? Was it in June, en juin? Was it close to noon, vers midi? So you can say when you did this. Je suis parti. Okay, you can also say how you got to that place. J'y suis allé. Now, what is the I for here? Remember le pronom I from chapitre 4? That means there. So, I went there en avion, by plane, en train, by train, en autocar, by long-distance bus, or en voiture, by car. De location, don't be fooled by location. It's a false cognate here. This means rental car. En voiture de location. J'y suis allé en voiture. So which one of these would you choose if you were going to this city that was mentioned in the first sentence there? J'y suis allé en... Okay, and finally you could use a verb like arriver. Okay? Je suis arrivé le même jour, the same day, 3 heures plus tard, 3 hours later, or le lendemain. And that would be like the day after yesterday. Oh, le lendemain. So, je suis arrivé. And you can say which one of those would apply to you. Okay. Another thing I'm going to point out to you about all of these now that you've had a chance to practice saying them is that all of these verbs, all the past participles of these verbs have this special ending or special optional ending, which is I, right? Whenever you're conjugating a verb in the passé composé using être as its helping verb, and you'll have to memorize with your experience and over time which verbs use être as their helping verb, you have to make an agreement depending on who's doing the speaking. In my case, since I am female, I would need to add I to all of these verbs if I'm saying them and writing them about myself. Je suis allé. I would spell it with the I. If you are male, you would not use the I. You would leave it dropped off. So if you are a male using this sentence, you would say je suis allé, but you would take this part off. Okay, it would look just like that. So we put it there as an option just because it depends on who's speaking. It all depends on the subject. All right, so that gives you at least an idea of how this form of passé composé is put together. We know that we can use either avoir with certain verbs or être with other verbs. All right, let's take a look at some other examples. So if you're traveling, you can use this with lots of other verbs. So descendre is kind of like to, in the case of à l'hôtel, it's kind of like to go into the hotel, to go inside of it. With the verb aller, which is to go, the verb rester, to stay. So all of these, you might notice, are verbs of motion. They're verbs where you're doing something of some kind. You're going from one place to another. Je suis descendu à l'hôtel. So I went into the hotel. Je suis allé dans un camping. And notice the liaison. The S is pronounced because aller begins with a vowel. Je suis allé dans un camping. So I went to a campground. Je suis resté chez des amis or chez des parents. Des, the S is going to be pronounced because ami begins with a vowel. So I stayed at my friend's place or I stayed at my parents' place. Je suis allé à la plage, à un concert, en boîte. En boîte is to go out dancing to a nightclub. Je suis resté une nuit, so I stayed one night. Le week-end, 3 jours, 3 days. Or je suis rentré. So entrer means to enter. Rentrer means basically to come back. Je suis rentré 3 jours après. Or je suis rentré la semaine. Je suis rentré la semaine suivante, the following week. Je suis rentré 2 semaines plus tard, so 2 weeks later. So you're describing when you came back. Okay, moving on. This shows you basically the breakdown of how this form of le passé composé is conjugated. Okay, so if I'm using a verb like aller, to go, or a verb like sortir, I'm going to be using the verb être as my helping verb. So you might be kind of wondering, well, how do I know which verbs to do this with? Okay, so I can go ahead and show you something here called the house of être. And you can Google this on your own time off of watching this video. But there are all kinds of images that you could download here that basically give you an overview of which verbs you use the passé composé with. We can even look at this one right here called la maison d'être. Okay, so these are basically all the verbs where you use être as your helping verb. So as it tells us here, most French verbs use avoir as an auxiliary verb when conjugated in passé composé, but fewer verbs use être. So in this infographic, you can see which ones do require être. And I can even post a copy of this underneath this video in the chapitre 5 folder so that you kind of can see this visually. Okay, so all the verbs that would require être are kind of put into this thing we call la maison d'être, the house of être. So, partir, arriver, passer, aller, mourir. These are all like these motion verbs down at the bottom. You can go out somewhere, you can arrive somewhere, you can kind of pass through somewhere, you can go somewhere, and you can even pass away. Inside the house itself, you can venir, you can come, rentrer, monter, descendre, sortir, retourner, revenir. These are all things that kind of happen as you're going in and out of the house, right? As you move to the second floor, we see rester, which is to stay. So if you're on the second floor, you're probably not going anywhere right away. Tomber, unfortunately, if you were on the roof of the house, you might fall down. And naître is to arrive in the house in the first place by being born. So it's kind of an interesting way to think of which verbs to conjugate. Many of them are like motion verbs, as I mentioned before. Okay, and if you take one of those verbs and conjugate it, you can see that we have forms of être as our helping verbs for all of these. And then the past participle that comes after it just depends on who's doing the speaking. So, je suis allé, the E depends on who je is. If je is me, I'm going to add an E there. If je is referring to a male, you do not need to add the E there. By contrast, if you have nous sommes allés, aller will depend again on who nous is referring to. So, aller would have to have an S because nous is a plural group of people. If it's all women, then you would include the E. If it's a mixed group of male and female, you would take out the E and just leave the S. So the optional element is the one in parentheses. So just to pronounce this entire conjugation so you can hear it, also listen for the liaison where maybe some silent S's are pronounced. And this will get you kind of familiar with this conjugation of the verb aller, to go. Je suis allé, tu es allé, il est allé, elle est allée, on est allé, nous sommes allés, vous êtes allés, ils sont allés, elles sont allées. Je suis sorti, tu es sorti, il est sorti, elle est sortie, on est sorti. They all sound the same, right? Nous sommes sortis, vous êtes sortis, ils sont sortis, elles sont sorties. Okay, so that's two good examples of how you conjugate those verbs in passé composé. All right. And just to give you an idea of some of the verbs that do get conjugated using le passé composé avec être. You see many of these already in the house of être that I will post along with this video in the chapter 5 folder. Okay. And finally, hey, these are a few more of those verbs. So you can see the je form of all of these as an example of how to conjugate those verbs in passé composé. And if you need to use the pronoun I or le pronom I for there, you put it just before the form of être. So that would be j'y suis allé, je n'y suis pas allé. So I went there or I did not go there. Okay. And finally, all right, so that takes us to what we'll be looking at next week, les expressions qui désignent le passé, so some expressions that designate the past or show us that it's past time. We'll begin with that in video 4 next week. So we're getting a little bit more familiar with the forms of passé composé avec avoir or avec être. You had a couple of chances to practice a few of these sentences in this video, and we'll keep on going with this topic next week. Au revoir, bon weekend!